This is World Solution Writing Process Podcast, Episode 27, Random Fragments, Part 10. To explain the podcast, just writing a book to bring down global capitalism, the book to bring down global capitalism, hopefully. However, writing it is very difficult, so the writing process is a podcast, this podcast. Now you know, that's it, that's the podcast. Let's get started with these fragments. Fascism Chapter Fragment. In 1975, the U.S. Intelligence Committee claimed that the CIA owns newspapers, magazines, book publishers, and more than 200 wire services. The New York Times claimed that there were 50 media operations and 12 publishing houses run by the CIA. Now, to what extent these are inside the country or outside, I would say it's probably a combination. Anyway, why regime change? Chapter fragment. To be absolutely clear, at this point we should be suspicious of all activity other than forming a revolutionary legislature and organizing anti-government protests in its name, and not around any other reform demand. Any reform demand. However, even anti-government protests are premature before establishing a parallel government, probably following discussion groups. Even workplace occupations now have their limitations without a revolutionary legislature. Multi-party socialism chapter fragments. Division is necessary, even highly specific ideological division. We must reject the economic model of total cooperativized decentralization and embrace a certain amount of nationalized/corporate style planning across the economy, but subjected to democracy. Decentralized cooperatives both create space for inequalities to emerge between firms, as well as retain the boom-bust cycle inherent to unplanned economies. Make no mistake, decentralized planning is non-planning, just the invisible hand of the free market all over again, whereas democratic planning equals central planning with democratic control. There can be a federative organization of the economy as well. The overall plan is democratically decided at larger scales, but minor local details can be decided democratically at the level of the workplaces or work teams. Class versus identity chapter fragment. Someone must be the Martin Luther of the Protestant Reformation of class versus identity, and it seems that role has fallen to the author. Why regime change chapter fragments. The change of regimes has not yet been accomplished at the theoretical level, and therefore cannot yet be accomplished practically. The anarchist fantasy is that you can simply smash the old center of power, and then the people will be free, an extension of the fantasy that society can be organized without main centers of decision-making. Instead, we must build a new center as the only and main way for the old center to be removed. West and the Rest Geopolitics chapter fragment. Russian national pride should be redirected away from the tradition of imperialism to the tradition of revolution, including socialist revolution. Class versus identity chapter fragments. You must call bullshit. You have to fight. You must call bullshit both in defense of yourself and against the legitimacy of the ruling government of your country. The class-focused position is like the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, for being a rebellion of cognitive dissent against a crushing, omnipresent, guilt-tripping dogma like the medieval Catholic theocracy and dogma against which the Protestant Reformation was a rebellion, treated as a heresy when in fact embodying a reversion to the original teaching. Change of government chapter fragment. The old government must be figuratively decapitated, not in the sense of executing individuals, but definitely in the logistical sense of sequestering key personnel and preventing them from meeting or communicating. Why regime change chapter fragments. There needs to be an ideological reformation, both within the socialist movement broadly, and in the democratic socialist movement specifically, first insisting on a parallel government, secondly denouncing the legitimacy of capitalist legislatures as undemocratic and beyond reform, and finally against the congressional reformist gradualist approach to socialism advocated by Bhaskar Sankara in his book, The Socialist Manifesto. More why regime change. It would seem Bordiga's revolutionary strategy involves the preservation and replication of Marxist texts, political education, and organization building. To this, the strategy of parallel government would add forming a parallel government and starting anti-government protests, rather than having no articulated on-ramp between the disparate activities of study groups and the final change of government. Also, such movements could spread these ideas to various organizations and individuals. Note that reform struggles are conspicuously absent from this list, and yet there is plenty of activity to keep a person busy. Class versus identity. Rather than an advancement, The New Left originated in a period of disintegration in which Marxism collapsed into Stalinism, Maoism, liberalism, and anarchism. Revolutionary Dictatorship Chapter, Fragment. Autonomy is a great principle, but capitalist conditions are not the time for it. Capitalist conditions require forging ourselves into victorious chains of command. Geopolitics Chapter, Fragment. Defending democracy at the level of nation-states is part of socialist revolution. Change of Government Chapter, Fragment. For an entry tool, you can get a battery-powered mini chainsaw for only $40 online. Fun. Class versus Identity Chapter, Fragment. The old left is now culturally closer to what is considered centrism by the new left, which has become the whole modern left. Dictatorship Chapter, Fragment. Revolutionary Dictatorship. With power comes great suffering. Humans naturally desire the closeness of companionship, and such closeness is only possible with equality. Power places you above and apart from others, and it hurts. To take power in order to establish a system which benefits the people may be seen as selfish, but is in fact a terrible sacrifice of your own humanity to the well-being of general humanity. Class versus Identity Chapter, Fragment. If you don't call bullshit, the bullshit builds up and takes over everything. Parallel government. If you don't have an alternative decision-making center built, militant disruption only results in the deeper entrenchment of the class hierarchy in one form or another. Fascism Chapter, Fragment. Fascism steals the initiative from revolutionists with its continuous offensive, keeping us continually responding to itself instead of asserting our own agenda, weakening us further. We must steal the initiative back by realizing that bourgeois institutions will unreliably protect us from fascism. Will not reliably protect us from fascism. To break out of the fascist despair loop, we must go on the offensive against capitalism itself. Time is running out. Intro Chapter, Fragment. Any true humanitarian would be primarily concerned with climate and imperialism, but both of these issues are so deeply entrenched in capitalism that it makes little sense to focus on them, instead of focusing on their root cause in the economic system. Combat Chapter, Fragment. Military hand signals can be looked up on the internet without drawing suspicion due to all the gamers, military personnel, and right-wing militias always looking them up. Dictatorship Chapter, Fragment. There are uncanny parallels between Napoleon and Trotsky, both revolutionary military dictators, both exiled westward, both ridiculously brilliant. Main veins of Marxism Chapter, Fragment. The entire universe secretly revolves around Trotskyism. Once you know it, you can't forget. Nonviolence Chapter, Fragment. We are not in a military struggle against the United States of America. We are in a social struggle for control of the United States of America, which may take on a small or large military dimension depending on events beyond our control, but hopefully not. National Refoundation Chapter, Fragment. Yes, I wrote this while living in a pro-Trump trailer park inhabited by literal bald eagles. In fact, the author just saw a bald eagle in the woods the day of writing this sentence. National Refoundation Chapter, Fragment. The American flag is complex. Yes, it is an imperialist flag, but it has other dimensions which overshadow this. The American flag is the flag of the American people, and a flag of revolutionary democracy. It is also the flag which, by embracing it, will allow us to demonstrate continuity between the American people's revolutionary tradition with a new revolution and a new socialist state. The biggest coup we could ever achieve would be a socialist state draped in the red, white, and blue, for maximum psychological influence toward stabilizing and strengthening the new socialist order. Main veins of Marxism. Unorthodox Trotskyism is saving Trotskyism from itself. National Refoundation Chapter, Fragment. Our own nation's capital is not self-governing and is taxed without representation, with all actions of the D.C. City Council being reversible by Congress or the President. However, D.C. statehood would have to get through U.S. Congress. This is why Washington, D.C. needs its own parallel government. D.C. statehood is a transitional demand that can likely only be realized in a revolution. Okay, we're about halfway through. Class versus Identity, chapter fragment. The New Left, and by extension, the entire contemporary left, is a bankrupt political project because its fixation on its cultural politics obstructs its supposed class politics from being implemented in reality. West and the Rest Geopolitics chapter. Having experienced a megalomaniacal dictator and traumatized by the Cultural Revolution, yet not fully rejecting socialism, China is a country ripe for multi-party socialism and revolutionary democratic socialism, with greater self-management for the workers, though these ideas would certainly have to be spread and organized on a heavily underground basis within China, with support from publications hosted outside, with support from websites hosted outside of China, accessed inside China by VPN. Class versus Identity. It's possible that if we depict socialism as something for everyone, regardless of the left-right binary, that it will be able to convince many conservatives who otherwise would never have even been convinced by liberalism. Time is running out chapter. Many of this book's positions are contrary to the prevailing stances of the socialist movement. If you are not persuaded by them, then at least their antagonism can serve an agitating role. May my annoying positions aggravate you into revolt. Revolutionary Dictatorship chapter fragment. Sometimes the soldier of the people must fight their own people. Fascism chapter fragment. Many people in interwar Europe were driven to fascism by disillusionment with both capitalist liberalism and Stalinist socialism. Here's some comedy fragments. Reasons you should support my dictatorship. Elections are stressful, let's get rid of them. Parallel government chapter fragment. One example is the Bajoran provisional government from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Though that is provisional rather than parallel. All of those types are important though. Fascism chapter fragment. The French resistance was hampered for a time by the fact that the Communist Party was a strong force in France, and the Soviet-Nazi non-aggression pact meant that French communists were directed not to resist the fascist government in France until the Nazis broke the pact by invading the Soviet Union. That is fucking sad because that means the Holocaust was permitted not only by the non-intervention of the West, but also the non-intervention of the Soviet Union. We all look pretty bad. Revolutionary Dictatorship chapter. Dicta blanda is a Spanish term for a soft dictatorship, which preserves liberties and some formal democracy. Napoleon's revolutionary dictatorship was arguably a dicta blanda to an extent. And Cincinnatus was a famous Roman benevolent dictator who carried out his term of executive power by completing his task within 16 days, resigning, and going back to his farm. We should all hope to be like Cincinnatus. Maybe we need some stoic socialism. How the movement grows over time, chapter fragment. It will at times be necessary to engage in a form of monastic stoic socialism. As socialists, we often face highly abstract tasks that are not as superficially gripping as fighting on a battlefield. Sometimes we may have to write books or build organizations. It is weirdly slow and mundane work for a movement stereotyped for sudden bloody insurrections. National Refoundation chapter fragment. The American Democratic Socialist Revolution will have no access to external support or funding. It will have to rely entirely on its own resources. For funding, revolutionary movements usually depend on foreign support, donations, often from the wealthy, parenthesis, or for funding they may depend on crime or volunteer effort, which negates the need for funding. For us, there will be no foreign support. You know, we can't take money from Russia or China. Europe's not going to give us money. The Saudis, can we really trust them? Do we really want to be tainted by that influence? Yeah, or the Iranians even. So, anyway, for us there will be no foreign support. Gathering donations for a socialist movement tends to be unreliable, since people possessing enough money to donate naturally tend toward having a capitalist bias. That many movements do fund themselves by finding the wealthy socialist exceptions to this rule. The most reliable source of energy will always be unpaid volunteer effort. Change of government chapter fragment. You might be confused as to whom could have such detailed operational knowledge of infrastructure as takes place in certain changes of government. Certainly not socialist intellectuals. The utility companies have it, but they're not on our side. It is the workers and engineers in these utility companies who are the key, as well as a few bourgeois revolutionaries who have the time and energy to obsess over such matters, Trotsky, for example. This means infrastructural takeover only becomes possible when a sufficiently large population supports the parallel government that it spontaneously includes these specific workers within the wider workforce and wider population. National Refoundation Chapter Fragment. We must reject Sam Marcy's thesis in The Global Class War and the Destiny of American Labor. It's obvious that an American revolution would be either followed or preceded by global mass unrest, possibly both. However, the revolution in the USA has to have a specific national identity in order to constitute a new social order instead of remaining pure protest, disruption, and collapse. The destiny of the American Revolution and American working class is both intertwined and independent of the global struggle. Without self-assertion, the American Revolution and American working class cannot even complete their own struggle, let alone play the role as ultimate global spreader of revolution, if by nothing more than example alone. West and the Rest, Geopolitics. Rather than a pure Stalinist holdout, China has shifted to something more like an Asian tiger, combining state capitalism with austerity. Though China is also still a Stalinist holdout to an extent. A combination of these two forms. National Refoundation Chapter Fragment. Caleb Maupin's main problem is to assume that cutting any kind of deal with capital can produce socialism. Mao may have done this rhetorically at first with his block of 4 classes, but quickly the seizure of all capitalist assets in communist China became total, quickly upon the communists taking power, proving that this orientation was a temporary deceptive maneuver and not a reliable principle. West and the Rest Geopolitics Chapter. It would seem probable that a radical democratic socialism would be an emergent property common to many or most civilized alien species, and likely serves as a shared framework among multiple species, a shared framework humanity could either join or establish if it unexpectedly does not yet exist. This, and not Lieutenant Uhura's racial representation alone, is probably the implicit reason that Martin Luther King Jr. watched Star Trek, if you didn't know that. National Refoundation Chapter Fragment. The American Revolutionary Movement must take a fully independent stance from both the U.S. government and party system, as well as fully independent from the political control of foreign powers, and by extension, must be fully independent of economic support from foreign powers as well. Okay, West and the Rest, Geopolitics. 2 souls of Atlanticism. Democracy versus capitalist globalization. Despite Caleb Maupin's assertions, there's no reason to assume that Northeastern liberals have given up on domestic production as their model of political economy. With Biden's low-intensity revival of FDR-style infrastructure projects, as well as subsidizing the onshoring of critical microchip production. What is most mad is that Maupin is a supporter of the Chinese state, which is the main beneficiary of globalization, the main foreign undercutter of jobs in the United States. It's completely incoherent to be anti-globalization and pro-Chinese government simultaneously, when the main approach of the Chinese government is to grow China's economy using globalization, and this remains true despite a partial pivot in China towards self-reliance. Fascism Chapter Fragment. We must divert energy away from fascism, not merely repress fascism. If socialists don't give people the revolution they yearn for, the fascists will. A fascist revolution would have horrible results for its own base of participants, but it would release people's temptation toward an outburst of disruption and political upheaval. This is why January 6th happened. Okay, here's a note just for the podcast. The purpose is not to glorify process over result. The point is the result. Instead, the point is to acknowledge that every result is reached by a process. And while usual presentations hide the process, a Marxist and materialist presentation should reveal the process at least partially, in order to demonstrate the transition from confusion to clarity, which is at the heart of every social struggle. Hold the line. Capitalism is bad Chapter Fragment. Capitalism is the root of the wealth inequality that most people know about and hate. National Refoundation Chapter Fragment. Wealth inequality grew 5 times faster under Trump than Biden, destroying the notion among Caleb Maupin's writings and the, quote, MAGA communist movement that Trump represents productive capital versus liberalism's finance capital. It reveals that Trump is simply the extremist capitalist he openly advertises himself as being. Class versus Identity chapter fragment. Rather than all capital being in a conspiracy to uphold identity oppression, the reality is more that the ruling class cannot imagine a way out of the identity oppression, which is an emergent property of their own system. They don't want to imagine that their own system is the source of identity oppression, which it is, so they just mentally block it all out with either denial or powerless reforms. They don't want to imagine a world beyond capitalism as possible, or even worse, necessary. Crowd Revolution Strategy chapter fragment. To be clear, the strategy is not to trust the government, but to distrust it totally, while trusting in the possibility of a revolt by state employees against the legislature. Change of Government chapter fragment. At a certain point, the security forces may represent an insurmountable obstacle, refusing all persuasion, and space will have to be taken from them, dispersing them, preferably by riot, possibly by a small battle, or possibly both a riot and a shootout, as in the climax of Ukraine's 2014 revolution. West and the Rest Geopolitics chapter fragment. What Michael Parenti refers to as, quote, siege socialism, end quote, in his book Black Shirts and Reds, which is essentially Stalinism, which he excuses with imperialist encirclement, must be bypassed. This is because of both its past failures and intrinsic undesirability. We can bypass it by making the heart of global imperialism into the heart of global revolution. In addition, the rapid development and industrialization which Stalinists uphold as their main accomplishment still could have occurred with pluralist democracy using a planned economy, so the excuse of imperialist encirclement for Stalinist tyranny doesn't hold up. Finally, National Refoundation chapter fragment. State intelligence is a funny term. Are intelligence agencies truly intelligent? Or does their intrinsic institutional logic make them unintelligent in reality? What is true intelligence in general? Is state intelligence intrinsically at odds with actual intelligence, an oxymoron, as is often claimed of military intelligence? Information gathering can be more powerful than violence. What if true intelligence is the realization that conflict is not always necessary, or that national divisions themselves are not preferable, or that secrecy stifles innovation? Isn't cooperation the true intelligent option, at least when possible? Well, that is the end of this episode 27 of World Solution Writing Process Podcast. Thank you for helping me process my fragments of writing. Hopefully soon I'll get all these fragments done and sorted, and then I can start actually writing the chapters from being a scrambled mess into being a properly sequenced, coherent product. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the morale boost in writing this book that you listening gives me. This is World Solution Writing Process Podcast, episode 27, Random Fragments, part 10, signing off.